Hello, everyone, and welcome to the finale of Celebrate Babies Week 2020. We're so glad that you could all be here with us today. Now I'm going to introduce Cecilia Zalkind, who is the CEO and president at Advocates for Children of New Jersey.
Thank you, Hannah. And good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this conversation that's culminating our week to celebrate babies. This week has been a great opportunity to stress the importance of the early years to brain development and to highlight ways that we can support the healthy growth and development of our youngest children. Today's conversation is about supporting caregivers, parents, and teachers in their essential role in helping to ensure the development, mental health, and well-being of our babies. And as we know, relationships are critical to that development. Before I introduce Dr. Gerard Costa, who's our speaker today, I want to acknowledge and thank our partners in this week to celebrate babies. And I hope that you have seen the social media that's been out that shares tips, information. I think it's been an exciting week to highlight the importance of our youngest children. So let me acknowledge and thank our partners, NJC, the New Jersey Association for the Education of Young Children, the New Jersey Association of Infant Mental Health, Montclair State University, SITE, the Coalition of Infant Toddler Educators, SPAN, the Statewide Parent Advocacy Network, and the New Jersey Breastfeeding Coalition. Thank you not only for making this week such a success, but for all the work you do on behalf of our youngest children. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Gerard Costa, who's the director of the Center for Autism and Early Childhood Mental Health at Montclair State University. I have known Jerry for almost 20 years. We met in 2002 when New Jersey became part of the National Build Initiative, and Jerry argued then that infants and toddlers need to be not just included in a conversation about early care and education, but highlighted specially. Their needs are different, their relationships are critical to development, and most important, these years provide the opportunity to take actions that can have a positive lifelong impact. And it is also Jerry from whom I learned the phrase infant mental health, which I'm still trying to get my head around. We're looking for a different way to describe infant mental health. And I'm so excited to introduce Jerry and to have him on the phone today, because I don't know of anyone who is a better expert, not just in New Jersey, but on the national and the international level on babies and their needs and what does it mean to support their healthy growth and development. I've had the opportunity to participate in training that Jerry has done many times, including once, I don't know if you remember this, Jerry, when you trained the child welfare system staff, the court system staff on young children in foster care. There were about 400 people in the room, and you could hear a pin drop because the training and the conversation on Jerry's part was so compelling. Your knowledge, your compassion are extraordinary, and I'm really excited to introduce you and to listen to your presentation today. Welcome, Jerry.
I had to unmute myself. Sorry, Seal. We just talked about that. Thank you so much, Seal. And what an honor for me to be a collaborator and partner with you for all these years, and with ACNJ, whose role in our state has been remarkable, has been really at the forefront of bringing awareness to the critically important areas of early childhood, certainly for the years that you led the preschool initiatives in our state that have resulted in so many remarkable advances that New Jersey has modeled well for the nation. And you continue to be sure that the state stays honest about their commitment to preschool, but certainly for the past number of years, beginning with the Build Initiative and membership on the council, New Jersey Council for Young Children, and certainly in all of the work that's happened that ACNJ has led, and in partnership with our center and the YCS Institute and the New Jersey Association. I am so proud of what New Jersey has done and what New Jersey is doing, and I've really been so proud to be part of this initiative. And again, I've always wanted to be sure that we tell the story of New Jersey and be sure to highlight the critical role ACNJ has played in that regard, especially now leading the Think Babies Coalition and planning this wonderful week. And thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Catherine, the IT, and I'm sure you wear other hats besides that, specialist, for setting this up. So we have a lot to cover. And for those who might know me, I try to follow, or I try to defy my father-in-law's guidance, which is you can't squeeze 10 pounds of bologna into a 5-pound bag. I continue to try to do that. So I've packed a lot in today's presentation, but I actually hope it will be not only informative and give you a sense of how critical relationships are for young infants, but it will be entertaining in a way to kind of open your eyes. I was lucky enough to have as one of my teachers, Michael Trout, who was a student of Selma Freiberg, the leader of our field. And he said to me, Professor Freiberg opened our eyes and we couldn't close them again. And I think that's really been the case, I think, in my life and I think in the lives of the people with whom I work closely. So the title is really celebrating babies by embracing the essential role of the caregiver. And I talk about honoring the attuned caregiver. So let me be sure this works. So I'm going to go over quickly, and I know this sounds like a lot, but I believe I can get it all in there. I'd like to speak just about the nature of human interaction. What happens when we engage each other, and certainly what happens when babies are engaged by the adults in their life. And that really brings us to understanding a field of study that's been known as, for many years, interpersonal neurobiology, that our brains, in fact, are co-constructed through the nature of relationships. And I'll talk about that. I'll talk really essentially about how connectedness, being connected and feeling safe, are biological imperatives. They're evolutionary imperatives. They are required for us to thrive and to grow and to learn. And how we move from really being reliant on others in our lives, the co-regulation, to internalizing ways of even helping ourselves and regulating ourselves. Although you'll see in my presentation, I want you to know there's a limit to that. That even for adults, when stress gets high, and we know about that, don't we, through COVID and through the political landscape and the systemic racism and all the troubling features of our lives in this 21st century, we know that requires us to be reliant on each other. All of this is because of the way in which our brains are developed, and that we have a unique area of brain systems that are most promising for growth and development and for interdependence and the creation of a just and safe society, and that's the triune brain. We're going to talk about the systems of our brain and what happens when stress and trauma occur. One of the policy implications that I will share, and I know there are many that will grow, I think, from our insights, I hope, together today, is to focus on a concept that I've been calling formation. And I've just written a chapter, and I think I actually gave permission for Catherine and Hannah to share that. It would be published in early 2021, but it's about a way of thinking about what our mission is in infant and early childhood mental health work. And that is to focus not only on knowledge and skill development in the people with whom we work and the people who form relationships, but to help them focus on the notion of being with, of what relationships mean. So I begin, and I won't go into much detail, but I love this picture. It's actually a little video from YouTube. There's the link, and you can see, imagine a 6-week-old baby awakening. And had I more time, I would actually walk you through an imagined sequence of things that would happen when the baby wakened. And I would even share with you what happens if the baby wakens and is greeted by a parent who sort of really interested in this baby and invested in this baby and helps them transition from sleeping to waking. And then I might share, and then I would share a scenario where, in fact, the baby is greeted by a very different experience upon their waking, by a parent that might be so themselves troubled and wounded and preoccupied and unavailable that giving the baby that interpersonal space to really make the transition and feel that they are welcomed for that one day. And I compare those two and wonder about brain systems that occur. And so I want to tell you that one of the illustrations I've used to talk about this concept is imagine this scenario. Imagine if we identified 365 wonderful people we all would agree are the kind of people that we would want to care for our babies. They have the qualities, the characteristics, the ways of knowing, ways of doing, and ways of being with that we all would want to cultivate in formation. And then imagine I took a newborn baby and gave that baby to be raised by that first person. And then every day for 1 year, that person changes the baby's care to the second person and the third person, and so on for 365 days. Imagine if that baby were cared for by someone different each day, even if we thought the care reached a high level of attunement, or at least a high level of respect and honoring the baby. I don't think it takes a brain scientist or an infant mental health specialist to recognize how toxic that would be. And yet, in a maybe not so dramatic way, we have for years witnessed children being moved from space to space and placement to placement in an attempt to find the best way to take care of them, failing to remember that it wasn't only them that had to be cared for, but it was the caregiver that was responding to them and caring for them and loving them. And that's because babies, human infants, are an altricial species. Compared to the mammals, compared to the young of other large mammals, human babies are incredibly helpless. Altricial means they must rely on others. They're incapable of moving about, of rooting, of gathering food, of caring for themselves, of regulating their temperature, and so on. And so secondary altriciality is the idea that human infants need an extended infancy, almost replicating the care of a womb, if the womb can be imagined as one that was without invasion or without toxicity. So they're born helpless relative to other mammals. And so human infants require a second womb. But this womb is a psychological, social, interpersonal, and emotional, and physiological, believe it or not. There is this exchange of sensory systems and touch that are critical to babies. And so for the first 2 years of life, at least, as we develop language, as babies develop language, I would even go further beyond that. Infants require care. We are not a species that does it on our own, and our mistaken beliefs in the past that somehow babies will be okay no matter what we subject them to, no matter what shifts we make. I often used to use an analogy that a dear colleague of mine had a brother who was the curator of antique instruments for a museum in New York City. And they had a saying in that field that when an antique instrument was moved from space to space for displays, they would say 3 moves equals 1 fire. And what they meant by that was that for the instrument, no matter how much you tried your best to package it and save it from being damaged, if you continue to move it, it gets damaged. 3 moves equals 1 fire. Think of the many families that you have known. And one of my earliest infant mental health cases was with a 12-year-old mother who was 6 months pregnant. She had been in 32 different foster homes, 32 different foster homes. And so what were we doing? It wasn't 365 days, but it was nonetheless an overwhelmingly toxic idea, because from secondary altriciality, upward, she wasn't provided with the kind of womb, then attuned care that I hope we can talk about in the next hour. So my daughter is an occupational therapist, and I love her, Ryan Elizabeth. Ryan is just a cool person, and when she was in high school and college, sometimes she would travel with me on some of my presentations, and she came with me once to Wisconsin to do a presentation, and we spent a little time there. And in my presentation, I gave this saying. Dr. Lori Sullivan, my colleague, and I at Montclair State University have known each other for years, and we would often say that if we had a bumper sticker, it would say, "In the beginning, there was the relationship." And so my daughter heard me say that. And about 5 years ago, many years after she heard the presentation, I got something in the mail, and she sent me a couple of these bumper stickers. So this is one of them that I took a picture of. In the beginning, there was the relationship. So Caitlin Mulcahy, Dr. Caitlin Mulcahy, and I, our associate director, who you all know and love, I think, like I do, have talked about maybe we should produce this as a fundraiser for us. So stay tuned. Anyway. So it's about the relationship. It's about what happens and what are the primary requirements. Now, this is a very non-exhaustive list, but I want you to think about the fact that stress is a common encounter in our lives, in the first moments of life. And so helping us regulate stress, helping us then feel regulated and calm enough to engage with each other. And that requires that the people in our lives tune into us, convey to us that they have an idea of what our inner life is like, that they respond to us contingently, meaning that when we behave in a certain way, they respond in accord with what we've just done. There's a connectedness, a sense of empowerment and mastery, that what we do makes a shift in someone else towards us that increases our capacity to believe we mean something. And that leads to reciprocity, often called in neurology terms, serve and return. In play, it's sometimes called, as Dr. Stanley Greenspan would say, opening and closing circles of communication. And it's that continuous reciprocity and mutuality and sharing that actually gives rise to the capacity for our mind to represent the world using images and language. And then we use those images and languages to continue to grow a more complex mind. Dr. Stanley Greenspan, one of my teachers and mentors, would say that what we need from others are textured communications, the kind of communications that involve nuance and subtlety and real variation. And I think that is really a statement in the first several years of life, what we mean by relationships. So, this may surprise you, but I've been trying to think for years. I've been using the image of the Jack-in-the-Box. This actually came to me in one of my clinical cases. I was working with a mom who had lost her mother. She lived with her grandmother, and she had given birth to her first child, lived with her grandmother, but her grandmother passed away. And this mom really needed help in knowing how to care for this child. I believe she had some limitations, but certainly much less than the system thought. And in one of my meetings with her, addressing the fact that her babies had been placed in foster care and that she had been very inconsistent visits with them, I said to her, Darla, what do babies need from mommies? And she said, well, you have to take care of them. If they're sick, you have to bring them to the doctor. You have to feed them and bathe them and change them. And I said, you're absolutely right. And in a sense, kind of all the custodial things, right? But I said, but Darla, what do you think babies need from their mothers emotionally? And she said, I really don't know. So I said, well, you know what a Jack-in-the-Box is? And she said, yeah. So I did the Jack-in-the-Box, and I asked her to kind of come along with me. And she made believe the imaginary crank, and then the Jack pops up. And I said to her, darling, what does the baby do? And she made a perfect face. She goes, and I said, you're absolutely right. And she said, maybe the baby would cry. And I said, you're spot on. And then what would the baby do next? I said to her. And she got it. She said the baby would look at his mother. And I said, you were absolutely right, because the baby needs to make sense of it, right? And so I said, let's do this over again. And we did it. And we made the face of the baby. We looked at the mother imaginary, in an imaginary scene, looked back, and the mother's face is calm and okay, and helps the baby know that this moment is not bad. It scared you, and we'll figure a way through it, but you're safe and we'll be fine. So at the end of the session, we talked, and as she was leaving, I said, do you have any questions, Dorla, about what we talked about? She says, no, but I have to say, I never knew about that Jack-in-the-Box thing. And I used to call this the Jack-in-the-Box thing. I changed it to the Jack-in-the-Box moment because it's a moment. So I want to share it with you. So this is a little boy named Dane who has seen the Jack-in-the-Box once before. And I'm going to show you what happens for Dane as he is about to see the Jack-in-the-Box for the second time. And I'm going to unpack this with you as a way of talking about why caregivers, and by the way, of a certain type, an attuned, caring, predictable, consistent, loving, co-regulated caregiver is important. So take a look at Dane, about 7 months old, and see what he does. Oh, sorry about that. What happened?
Okay, here we go. Ready? What's wrong, big guy? It's just
So that's a moment in Dane's life, right? That's a moment in Dane's life. And so I want to unpack it with you, right? Now, this is, again, the second time that Dane has seen the Jack-in-the-Box, right? So what happens in the beginning? He's looking at the Jack-in-the-Box as the crank is being played. What does he do? He looks at his mother. From the first moments of life, Dane has this tendency that probably is intrinsic to all of us to look at social others to figure out the meaning of this moment. He comes back, looks at the scary Jack. It pops up, his eyes wide open. He sees it. He cries. He's frightened. He's upset. What does he do? He looks at his mother again and says, hey, make sense of this for me. What is going on? And she swoops in, picks him up with a caring, lilting voice, helps him recover from this moment. So what's going on? Well, it turns out this whole field of interpersonal neurobiology is giving us some real information about what happens in early exchanges. This is taken from a wonderful British infant mental health specialist named Colwyn Trevarthen. And Colwyn Trevarthen has described this exchange that happens between mothers and babies, by the way, fathers and babies, grandmothers and babies, child caregivers and providers, infant toddler specialists, early childhood folk, everybody, right, who is with the baby. And this exchange of information, movement, sensory systems, smell, taste, touch, everything, hearing, all of these things are going back and forth. Another figure in our field of neuropsychology, Dr. Alan Shore from the University, UCLA, has talked about the idea that the mother's brain, the limbic system, which I'll touch on, communicates directly to the baby's limbic system. And so this is going on, right, between Dane and his mother, right? Something is happening. And so Dane has this brain inside of him, right? And so the brain, by the way, is this social organ that's developed only or primarily through interactions and relationships. So let's unpack the brain a little bit more. Let's sort of figure out what is happening in these moments. Well, in the moment that we saw Dane looking at the Jack and anticipating you can see that by his lowering of his lip, his looking at his mother like he knew something frightening was coming. We know that at that point, his red brain, right in the middle, that limbic system, was beginning to determine that something frightening is happening. In a sense, it began to turn on the fight or flight or freeze response, right? And by the way, the blue brain that you see here, that's the cortex, the top of our brain, which has all of these remarkable folds and convolutions, right? That brain, which gives us the ability to reason, to think, to remember, to analyze, to evaluate, to anticipate, all of these things. When the red brain gets activated, the blue brain becomes less available. One way of saying that is when the survival brain activates, the thinking brain gets derailed, right? So in that moment, what happens when stress occurs? And our triune brain system is such that we have an old brain, that's the brown brain, the reptilian brain, that governs our circulation or heart rate or digestion, all of those autonomic and automatic functions. Then that red brain is the more social brain because it looks and constantly engages the world to determine what's going on. It's much more than danger alert. I want you to know. It's certainly important for danger alert, but it also involves a whole host of other wonderful things that we bring to the table, especially when we are passionate. In fact, for those who remember color mixing in grammar school, while we know the red brain can deactivate the blue brain, a lot of our activities involve the purple brain, which is the combination of the red and the blue. So, but for now, I want you to think of young Dane, early in life, figuring out this world through the nature of his relationships with others. And so that red brain contains two principal organs I want to touch on. That's the amygdala, these social processes, and this is the left side and the right side of your brain, right? And it involves the hippocampus, forgive me. The hippocampus is a memory center. So the amygdala begins to process, is this safe or not? This moment, this face, this person, this touching, this, overall experience of being with this person. Is the amygdala is saying, is this person safe and okay? And if the answer is yes, the amygdala stores that information in the hippocampus, this other organ that's really involved in processing memories. If the amygdala determines that this is a frightening moment, then that too is stored in the hippocampus. Now, it's fascinating, I think, to understand how remarkable the brain is, that it's designed to store information about those things that work and those things that don't, to keep us safe in the future. What's fascinating even more is that both of these organs, the amygdala and the hippocampus, change as a result of experience. So that, for example, and this may surprise you, and I wish we had a chance to talk back and forth, but you might want to, I'll challenge you, what profession do you think uses the hippocampus a lot and it actually grows larger because they use it so much? We should have taken a survey, right, Hannah? Well, I'll tell you the answer. Taxi cab drivers. Taxi cab drivers have reliably been found to have larger hippocampi because they use it all the time, that short-term memory, that long-term memory. So babies, however, early on in life are forming these memories. Now, it won't take a brain scientist to say if there's a chronic activation of the amygdala, if there's a chronic activation of the fight or flight or freeze response, what we will soon call the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal, the HPA axis. If there's a chronic activation and the hippocampus remembers that, children begin to become wired at a high state of alert and activation. And what suffers? The blue brain, the activation. So what happens? How do we solve these things? How do we help children? It's through relationships. It's through attuned, caring, predictable, consistent relationships. So the limbic system that we've talked about and the amygdala that we've touched on are real structures that are formed on the basis of real experiences in life, and they begin to get wired to interpret those new experiences. So for Dane right now, if the only thing Dane saw was a scary jack-in-the-box, and there was no intervention or different experience led by those in his life to organize that, he would be wired to feel fear every time he saw that, right? We know, fortunately, that that doesn't happen in life, or at least it shouldn't happen, right? But we know that when the amygdala gets activated, it can really derail your thinking, derail your brain. So some of you may have seen this. We do it in KBCM and others, but this is Dan Siegel, a remarkable psychiatrist and neurologist and and clinician and author. And he heads the Mind Institute in California, and he developed what's called the handy model of the brain, and you can almost see it. So he imagines if you hold your hand up as if you're doing a salute, if you look at the end knuckle of your thumb as the amygdala and the top joint as the hippocampus, kind of, or at least the joint between the knuckle and the mid joint on your thumb, that would be your limbic system, and you would put it in the middle of your hand and cover your hand, which would be the cortex. And you have a left cortex and a right cortex, right? And so what happens? Well, when your amygdala gets activated, you flip your lid, right? You flip your lid. And that's one of our favorite sayings, by the way, for those of you who don't work with infants and young children, but you work with other children, or if you're married or in a partnership, you all have flipped your lid, right? And you'll learn what's the best thing to do when a lid is flipped, right? The best thing to do is to not increase the activation of the fear response, but to co-regulate. And so we'll talk about that. But for now, caregivers have this remarkable ability to really help children figure out how to handle these early life stressors. This is from Dan Siegel's book, Mindsight. So as I said, if you lift up your fingers, you have an image of how we flip our lids and head down the low road. And by the way, Daniel Goleman, you may have heard of him, is someone who's written extensively about social intelligence and emotional intelligence. He talks about this as the subcortex, that's the below the cortex, hijacking the cortex. And I think we've all had that experience. We've probably seen many of our leaders head down the low road and also have their subcortex hijack their cortex. So, of course, unlike Las Vegas, what happens in the amygdala doesn't stay there, right? It actually goes throughout the brain. What happens? It primarily sends a signal to the hypothalamus, that organ right in the center of the picture. And the hypothalamus sends through the bloodstream hormones throughout the body that land in the pituitary gland, and then they go in the bloodstream to the adrenal glands, which hang above your kidneys. And so the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis is often called the trauma axis or the fight or flight axis. So Alan Shore, as I said that when the mother's limbic system communicates to the baby's limbic system, that goes both ways. That means that when the baby is frightened, the caregiver needs to be there, right? And also, if the baby, in fact, is not frightened, but has a parent who is, or who is preoccupied by fear, it will also become their experience as well. So let's revisit Dane a little while, about a month later. Remember, the last time we left Dane, he was in distress, because his brain and the HPA system was activated. But what happened to Dane since that time? Well, let me show you.
Okay, let's show everyone what a big boy you are. Okay, here we go. That came out early, didn't it? Let's try again. You know it's gonna come, don't you?
I'm going to unpack this.
We like it now. Mwah. Yay! the Jack in the Box.
So I love this. I love this. This is about a month and a half or a month later. Obviously, Dane and his mom have had a number of encounters with the Jack in the Box. It's kind of like, his in-laws came over the first time and it didn't work, but he kept visiting with the in-laws and suddenly he's okay with them. But I want you to think about what happened. So there is Dane looking at the Jack in the Box. Remember, before this, as it first occurred, this was a frightening element. What does he do? He anticipates that something is about to happen. He looks at it, and what does he do? Looks at his mom. Again, he'll always look at the caregiver. He'll figure out, what does this mean? Now, by the way, he takes it in, there's no distress. However, he grabs an object and puts it in his mouth, needing a little comfort, right? We are oral people, we soothe ourselves, but he still hangs in there. He keeps his eyes on the prior source of fear. He then, when it closes and it's about to come up again, he grimaces, keeps his eyes on it, looks at it again, looks at his mother. She swoops in and says, "You did a great job." As far as Dane is concerned, he acknowledges it. He lifts up his arms and he's ready to take on the world. And he conquered it. How did this happen? How did he not only create an opportunity, or they create an opportunity for him to really tolerate this, but for him to have, in fact, mastered fear and become resilient in the face of the things that provide stress? It's the nature of the caring relationship, the organizing, attuned relationship. And again, what we said with Colwyn Trevarthen earlier, this is what happens, right? And Dean's brain now, instead of sending all of these alert signals throughout the brain, now sends all of these soothing signals, engaging and connecting the parts of the brain, all in this unified experience that says, hey guys, we're okay with this. Don't turn on your HPA. You guys stay calm. Amygdala, tell the hippocampus we're okay with this. Mood centers in my cortex, boy, just start enjoying yourself, guys, because this is really okay. We have somebody taking care of us. The world is safe and kind and all that stuff, right? So his prefrontal cortex ready for thought and reciprocity. That was derailed, if you remember, under fear. He has elevated positive mood in the cortex that are activated. His HPA is not activated. There's no adrenaline rush, which is the adrenal glands, right? And so here's what I want to share with you. I call this the Jack in the Box moment, right? And what I'd like to say to you is that there are millions of moments that happen in the lives of infants and toddlers well before preschool, right? So preschool is critical. But birth to 3 and pregnancy to 3, and we have to get into maternal health, as you know, which is a big part of our space as well. So I've often been thinking maybe a good way to remind everybody in infant mental health is to sing this together, right? So for those who've seen Rent, it's a wonderful musical, but I love this song, which is 525,600 minutes. What does it take to measure a year? Right? The millions of moments that babies go through, and they need, for most of that time, a responsive, sensitive caregiver. Now, this is my supercalifragilisticexpialidocious word for infant mental health specialists. So I'm going to share this with you. I hope you get a kick out of it. I hope you sort of are smiling to yourselves, because here's what I want you to understand. When an infant, and by the way, when we as adults experience moments of living, what Dan Stern called lived moments or lived experiences, they involve a neurological and body state, right? When we're happy, our body state and neurology is different than when we are sad or afraid or angry. It involves some growth of our own personal psychology. What do we think about ourselves? Am I safe? Am I happy? Is the world a safe place for me? Do people like me and enjoy me and care for me? It also creates ideas about the world. Is the world a good place? Not only am I safe, is the world a predictable place? This all happens within the context of feeling states, affective, and they occur through interpersonal connections. So the supercalifragilisticexpialidocious word of the day is, we experience life as somatopsychologic, ideational, affective, interpersonal bundles. That this is what life is about. We have to know that it activates our bodies and our feelings about ourselves and ideas about the world. And they all are encapsulated in feeling states, and they're created and modified through interpersonal bundles. And through those interpersonal bundles, by the way, these processes, we begin to develop ideas about the world, anticipations. You could see already that Dane in that month later anticipated what was coming and was ready for it, right? So we develop what are called expectations. And in fact, what we hope happen in secure relationships is children develop both psychologically and neurobiologically, they develop confident expectations of what's about to happen, right? And so repeated patterns actually become part of our package, for good or for bad, by the way. I've often talked about this notion that when things go well, our brain is biologized, meaning that actual anatomical and physical and chemical changes occur within our brain. And that's true when things don't go well. So the good and the bad and the ugly get biologized, become part of our brain structure. And so for those who really thought this was just an experience thing, it's important for you to know it's much more than that. It's actually hardwired of brain systems. Now, I think all of you know this, but at the risk of repeating it, I want to remind you of this remarkable series of studies by Ed Tronick at the University of Massachusetts about the still face. And again, forgive me, those who've attended KBCM and others, but for those few who maybe didn't, it's important to look at it. So this is a little paradigm, an experiment, asking a mother of a 7 or 8 month old little girl, I think in this case, to create a still face, to stop responding to the baby that she is engaging with. So let me do this.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby who's about a year of age.
I'm like a girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this, and then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, come on, why aren't we doing this? Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it, they actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here.
How forgiving, right?
And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, what a big girl.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
You know, I think Ed Tronick's work has become one of the most seminal pieces of research that have informed us about the remarkable complexity of the infant mind and relationship systems. Through this work, he and his team have developed a lot of greater understanding of what happens when parents are emotionally unavailable, as in perinatal postpartum and perinatal depression. What happens when parents are emotionally unavailable for other reasons, mental illness, substance abuse, or what happens when there are too many different people who serve in that role, the 365 different faces that babies never get to practice with. I often said that I could tell when I was a kid if my mother was angry at me for something I did in church, because that one muscle in her face, I knew. Nobody else could see that one muscle twitch, but I knew I was in trouble, so that when she was kind to everybody in church, I was still going to be in trouble when I got home, because babies are students of faces. This baby by 7-8 months knows this mother and knows the schema of interaction. What do we do? Why, as Ed Tronick said, why aren't we doing it? These are critical to develop brain circuitry that is about social engagement, is about co-regulation, is about reciprocity, serve and return. These are all the things that happen. And so when a rupture occurs like it did, the interbrain, the connection between them is lost. And then, of course, there is repair. But imagine if there was no repair, the ugly. Or imagine if even in the Jack-in-the-Box, a Jack-in-the-Box popped up, but there was no parent to give the child meaning as to what this is. Or if the parent was unavailable emotionally, they were distracted or depressed or upset or angry. Or even imagine if the baby's fear triggered in the parent a response that the parent almost continued to activate. As if the parent would make the child more frightened, not for any reason of not loving the child, but because of a revisiting, perhaps, of patterns in their own life that felt that way to them. So this notion of relationships is obviously not about 100% of the time we need to be with our children and tuned into them. Many times the data would say at least 20 to 30% of the time we try to be connected with our kids. The other 70, 80% of the time, we're spinning in our own orbit. As Ed Tronick says, we're falling in of connection. We're falling out of connection. We're doing our own stuff. And that's great. But children, in fact, learn that through these ruptures, repairs can happen. They actually discover abilities they have for themselves. So this little child in the still face that you saw was trying her best, pointing, making a noise, making the faces, twisting her head, all saying, hey, Mom, get going. Problem solving. It's a remarkable thing. Ed Tronick's new book, by the way, written with a pediatrician, Claudia Gold, is The Power of Discord. I have it behind me. I had to remember The Power of Discord, because it really does something. So you obviously get the point, I think, that we are not saying that caregivers need to be perfect and that need to be there 100% of the time. But as Donald Winnicott says, they need to be there enough. They need to be good enough. And by all means, they need to be available when stress occurs and when unusual events occur. And of course, when good things happen, they need to be there to help child organize it as well. So what is happening early on is not only interpersonal and psychological, it's neurobiological. So look at these factoids, right, about the brain. By 5 months gestation, 5 months in the womb, the fetus already has 100 billion neurons, the amount of neurons we'll have as adults and about the number of stars in the Milky Way galaxy. But only about 20% of them are connected at birth, related to genetics and intrauterine life. So 80% of these connections are formed through the nature of experiences and the interpersonal connections. And each of those 100 billion can form up to 10,000 connections. And the connections can occur at a rate of about 700 a second or over 1 million a second in the first years of life. So I urge you to think of the brain or brains, because there's many parts of the brain, not as a noun, but as a verb, as a moving, activated, engaged, reflective organ that includes the capacity to be healthy for mental health issues. So brain health is mental health. So what we know most about this brain is that it grows from the inside out, right? The amygdala, the hippocampus, the internal organs really grow and are wired first. We know that when children are exposed to overwhelming stress, abuse, violence, and dysregulation, it changes the chemistry and the anatomy of the brain. And by the way, this is important. The right side of the brain, the right hemisphere, which is more responsive to affect, rhythm, tonality, music, right? The touch and movement and dance. Those parts of the brain are online more than the left brain. So before the left brain, the language brain, the more analytic brain, and that the lower systems we talked about, the amygdala and hippocampus, are online before the top of the brain. And that all of those lower systems, right brain and lower systems, are seeking always to see if they're safe. Little Dane, by the way, as this thing began to churn the second time he had seen it, looked at his mother. One of the things was a basic question: am I safe? So I'm going to talk a bit about that. But suffice it to say, these last two slides were meant to say to you, what's most important in the human caregiver, the essential caregiver? What's most important? Certainly consistency, predictability, attunement, meaning to be able to sort of figure out the inner life of the child and convey to the child that you think you've got an idea of what they're feeling. To be a regulating one. When they're upset, you calm down, right? When they need to sort of be activated, you can sort of rev them up a bit in a good way, right? That's all important. But it is even most important that you engage them with thoughtful ways of thinking about your own affect, your facial gestures, expressions, the tone of your voice, the movement and pacing. These are all received by babies and young children. And by the way, adults, more than our language or before our language. And sometimes when the messages conflict, the pre-verbal or nonverbal comes through and is believed and undoes the verbal message. And so I've said this often, this is a lesson in relationship therapy. If you have an argument with your partner and your partner looks irritated and you walk up to your husband or wife or partner and say, hey, you look mad at me. Did I do something wrong? And they go like this: no. I hope you don't listen to the words. That's not the typical male brain, right? I hope you don't listen to the words. I hope you are understanding there's something being conveyed through gestures. Babies are like that. Walk into any early childhood center, family daycare provider, infant toddler program. Walk into anyone, and I want you to look at the way that people are talking to the babies. I want you to look at the way the children are talking with each other. I want you to look at the way that the adults are talking to the children and the children are talking to the adults, because that will give you the first clue as to whether or not they're getting this. And to be honest with you, most of us haven't been taught this because the neuroscience behind it is relatively recent. And I guess intuitively, some people knew it. Some people got it. Some people knew that a softer voice and an affect could tone you down. But it's important for us to know that it's really part of our science now about caregiving. So I love this slide because it, in a sense, says to us early in life, if you go to the left side of this graphic, and that's created, by the way, by Dr. Arnold Samaroff, a psychologist at the University of Michigan. Michigan State University, Michigan State University, Arnold Samaroff. And what he says essentially is early in our lives as babies and young children, our ability to self-regulate is pretty small, that little circle on the left. But over time, in interaction with others, our ability to self-regulate and self-calm and help ourselves grows. But as I said to you earlier, even when we are fully adults, there are times that stress will occur, that we desperately need other people in our lives. We have witnessed this in our lives, depending on how old you are, many, many times. Certainly COVID has shown us this. We need each other. For those who were here for Superstorm Sandy, we knew that that meant people pulled together. For those of you who were here for 9/11, you know that there were times people at 9/11 got together and hugged each other in a way they hadn't since they were kids. So what I love about this is that how do children learn to self-regulate? Based on the co-regulating others. And here's the key I love about this graphic. What happens between us with others and ourselves. So what happens interpersonally becomes intrapersonal, becomes part of who we are. Our relationships form brain systems that actually become our owned brain systems, that our brains are changed by the nature of the relationships we have. And so the whole idea, and this is a longer conversation, about having children who are dysregulated, having a hard time, quote unquote, behaving. And the whole idea that we have to fix their behavior and focus on the behavior without thinking about the nature of relationships, their capacity for regulation or engagement, is neurodevelopmentally folly. It just is not the way we humans work. We are not governed only by behavioral control. What you see in behavior is the tail end of a whole host of developmental and neurobiological processes. So this graphic is really a nice one. So I'm going to try to go towards the end of our presentation to talk about a theory that has been proposed by a neuroscientist and occupational therapist named Stephen Porges. Stephen Porges developed a theory called polyvagal theory, and let me explain what that is. Our brain has 12 cranial nerves. These are 12 primary nerve bundles that affect our entire body. And I think it's the 10th cranial nerve, might be the 9th, but I think it's the 10th. It's called the vagus nerve, V-A-G-U-S. Well, it turns out that Stephen Porges believes that the cranial nerve, the vagus nerve has many branches, which it does, but he believes that it functions in a certain way, right? So what he proposes is that the vagus nerve, which begins at the base of the brainstem, a part of the brainstem that actually the brown brain part, branches come off of it that regulate the heart rate. So some of their nerve branches go to cardiac functioning, and other branches of it actually regulate the muscles of the face and the head. And he calls it a face-to-heart connection, so that by looking at a calm face, our heart rate can change. By looking at an angry face, our heart rate can change. And he talks about this, that over time, especially for humans, as we've evolved from other species, other mammals, our own unique hominids, that we actually formed what he calls an integrated social engaging system. And he argues that it is relationships and connectedness that in fact provides our greatest sense of safety. So he proposes that our nervous system needs to feel safe, and that what we do as humans is we look for features of safety to be present, such as a caring face-to-face interaction, warmly modulated voices. And when that happens, right, when our safety brain doesn't see that, it gets activated. We become less safe and more likely to feel the fight or flight or freeze response. And that deactivates our thinking brain. And that limits learning and growth, and even limits our ability to recover and be resilient. So he argues that connectedness is a biological imperative. Now, I suspect you see this already in some of the material I covered, that the right brain and subcortical systems are most sensitive to affect and gestures. Those are the things our caregivers need to know about the most. You know, I'm so sorry. I thought I shut this off, but it didn't seem to work. Sorry about that. I'm going to ask you just to put it up for two or three rings. So in the article that I cite here, and the references in the end of the presentation, Stephen Porges says humans are on a quest to calm neural defense systems by detecting features of safety. And this begins at birth when an infant's need to be soothed is dependent on the caregiver. So the exchanges that occur, the early exchanges, the millions of moments, the 525,600 minutes, right? These are constantly a grist for the mill for children to begin to incorporate a sense of their safety. And this is really what allows us to begin as humans to develop in a fully functioning way. So our body states, believe it or not, are conveyed through expressions and tone of voice, and they calm us or they can disrupt us, right? Our physiological state is signaled by a change in our voice. I think we all have had that experience. You get angry and your voice gets a little higher pitch. When you're angrier or aggressive, your pitch can get lower. These things happen automatically and others pick it up. And it happens below our level of awareness. This is called neuroception. It kind of bypasses our thinking brain. And so if our brain does perceive danger without our awareness, it seeks to somehow look for features of safety. So what he says is, the neuroception of familiar individuals and individuals with the appropriate prosody, intonation, and warm faces translates to a social interaction that downregulates defenses and enables feelings of safety. So in other words, to be more English, social behavior emerged as the prepotent regulator of physiology. So we saw this earlier, that now, in fact, we add the layer of idea that parents are not only there to organize children's experiences around unusual events, especially frightening events, but they're actually there to provide the foundations for what it means to feel safe and to be engaged. And this happens throughout, as I said, adulthood. So I'm an Italian. You may guess it, because if you can see my camera a bit, I'm moving my hands a lot. I love this because when I was a kid, I would go to friends' houses and I would notice sometimes parents would be arguing with each other. And I would say to my friend, what's going on here? I go, why are they yelling at each other? He goes, oh, that's the way they talk. They're not yelling. And so I love this little cartoon, which reminds us of individual differences, cultural differences, and so on. Half of my problems are because of the tone of my voice. Everyone thinks I'm arguing while I'm actually just talking. So we know this is true in all cultures. And by the way, this is even true aside from our voices and faces. We actually know that there are a whole host of ways to think about how we calm babies, and that includes rocking and moving. And it even includes things like singing and music and so on. So I want to show you this little clip of a comedian from Canada. Some of you may have seen this, named Michael Jr. Michael Jr. actually found an old videotape of when his daughter, Portland, was born. And he produced this video partly around Father's Day to talk about fathers. But I think it is so powerful to remind us how remarkable babies are from the first moments of life. To begin to look for safety and to need the essential caregiver to be with them. So I want you to take a look at this. Some of you, again, may have seen it, but I think you'll enjoy it.
Yo, comedian Michael Jr. here. As you know, I just flat out enjoy doing comedy. But one of the things I love way more than that is being a dad. Not too long ago, I'm going through some video footage and I run into this video of my youngest daughter being born. Now, of course, I was there. I actually took the video, but I had never really experienced it from this perspective before. Now, look, we're in the hospital room. She's sticky and she's baby and all that stuff, and she's in the middle of crying. And then I speak up. I start talking to her, and watch how she responds when she hears my voice.
Okay, Portland, look, I'm right here. It's okay, I'm right here, I'm right here.
We're doing just fine. It's okay. It's okay. I'm right here. Right here. Yeah, it's okay. It's okay, baby. It's okay. That was pretty awesome. So check it. A few minutes later, the nurse starts working on her, puts her pamper on her, and I'm not saying anything, and she actually starts to cry again. Then I speak up, she hears my voice, and stops crying. Like again. But I want you to notice what else happens after I tell her that I love her.
Mom hold you.
Portland, it's okay. It's okay. It's good. It's good. It's good. I'm right here. I'm right here. I am right here. I love you. I love you. I love you. Yeah, I'm right here. I'm right here. It's okay. It's okay. That's just phenomenal. I'm like, whoa. Here's the thing. We'll always have times where we're not as comfortable, probably even to the point of tears, where life is just heavy. The key thing to do in those moments is to be still and listen for the Father's voice, because He is trying to talk to you. And I can tell you what He wants you to know is that He loves you. All you got to do is open your eyes. Happy Father's Day.
So clearly, Michael Jr., it's, I think, a very moving moment and conveys, I think, an authentic capacity of babies. Of course, Michael Jr. also, I think, is messaging very profoundly for him an important religious theme, but also a father theme. And I think, I hope that that's something you can honor as well. But I think his real message to me is how amazing this relationship is. So what do we know about babies and brains and relationships? What are we going to? What do babies need, right? We know that the right side comes on before the left side. We know the amygdala and the systems below come on before the top of the brain. We know that children who are in relationships that are secure have differently wired brains. Believe it or not, that's the work of Alan Shore and others, that their brains are more efficiently wired. We know that the baby's more sensitive to affect and gesture and intonation than the words themselves. We know relationships matter, right? We know that the relationships are what organizes the brain. 80% of the wiring occurs through experiences postpartum, mediated by relationships. Again, we talked about the brain going inside out, and we know that when there's neglect, abuse, violence, and dysregulation, adversely changes the brain, that those experiences adversely change the brain. So pay attention to your facial expressions, your voice, and so on, so many things. So I wanted to do a very brief overview, and I want to check time. I think I'm going to take another 5 minutes, Hannah, and so let me know if that's okay. I think so. I'm going to assume yes. All right. So, and by the way, I have no idea if you've been hearing me for the past hour, because I can't see your faces and I haven't heard much. So it would be a hoot if I discovered that I've been talking to myself the whole time. So trauma and brain development. So we know that when bad things happen, something happens critically damaging to brain systems. Trauma can affect the infant and child brain. When that trauma happens, we know it's critical to know when, and that there are ways to help children even when things have not gone well. So the brain we've been talking about, right, that reptilian brain, that's the pink area, the brainstem. The red brain here is the green and the yellow, the limbic system, and then the blue brain's the neocortex. And so it grows from the bottom up. And so what happens when in fact infants, especially when in the infant's life, it is the caregivers that are frightening, who have not been available. My old mentor, Taya Bree, would remind me of the toxic effects of the sins of omission and the sins of commission. when the good things that need to happen don't happen and bad things do happen. And so both of these are critically important. So what happens to the infant when there is, in fact, a caregiving system that is hurtful and dangerous? We know that this child, as we said earlier, has a brain. And we know that that brain is affected by stress, and that stress can only be mediated and reduced by caring, loving adults. And our work, by the way, is to not punish parents only. That happens sometimes, but to help parents in their own way of understanding how critical they are and what in their lives has led them to the struggles they have as a parent. That's a big part of our infant parent mental health work. It's to have empathy for parents who sometimes don't do well by their child, but we need to help them do that, and whenever possible. So we know that when these things happen, children internalize a core negative affect about themselves. This is the somatopsychologic, ideational, affective, interpersonal part. They internalize in their own internal psychology a core negative affect about themselves. Sometimes I'm sorry that the slides will jump ahead. I think at one time I had a timer on them, so forgive me. But it also affects their ideation about the world, distrusting the caregiver and the world. They become less interactive with people. And we know, by the way, for the most part, that boys receive more negative affect and appear to need more help when they have these difficulties. So this child is this child when there's stress, and this happens, and it makes the child feel fear. And the old German proverb is, don't let fear make the wolf bigger than it is. The world becomes a different place through the lens of fear. Paul Tuff, a New Jersey journalist a number of years ago who lived in New Jersey, wrote a book called How Children Succeed. And for the most part, the book was a remarkable story of what happens in school programs that attend only to academics, but do not attend to what he called at the time the non-cognitive skills. Not sure I would call them that, but when they don't pay attention to the affective and regulation skills. And so he said that what happens when children are chronically under stress is they suffer from the firehouse effect. And that means their HPA system is chronically activated. And what's most affected is the prefrontal cortex, the thinking brain. Jack Shonkoff from the Center on the Developing Child, he and his team have written some science briefs about this in terms of executive functioning. So that's what suffers the most. And those are the abilities we have in our prefrontal cortex to evaluate, to delay gratification, to organize, to synthesize. Those suffer. And what he says is the air traffic control system of our brain, the system that helps us organize our thinking and output, is derailed. So it leads to these two types of states. If you think about the hand model of the brain, when the hand is intact, when the lid is intact, your fingers are intact, and your blue brain, your cortical brain, is there and ready to learn. That's called an open state. But when your lid is flipped, you tend to be more reactive, and that's the closed state. So which one will win, of course, is the one you feed the most. And so what we have been talking about throughout my presentation has really been to think about the engaged way in which caregivers need to cultivate the infant brain and the infant mind, to create systems that are safe, never speaking to your baby in rage. These are the things. When you make a mistake, apologize. Always be conscious of your affect, your gestures, your movements, your intonation, and pacing, as these are the most powerful in what your child feels and learns. Your infant is always watching you, so behave in models that create models of what it's like. And remember the millions of moments. These are not thousands. I should change this to the millions of moments that all of our children spend in our lives. And it's not just the parents we know, but all of those who interact with infants and their children. So we're all members of the village. So I created a little framework to help you, and I'll close with this, that when you see a child in distress, try your best to pause and look and figure out what might be going on. And of course, this little digested suggestion here is wonder about their biology, their psychology, and their social factors. There's a deeper way to think about that, but wonder what might be going on in their lives, and then generate hypotheses, ideas about how can you help support them in regulation through your emotions and your interactions. How can you be a helpful support to that child, and then act. But when you act, pay attention to your affect, your gestures, right? Because this is what children see, your movement, your posture, your pacing, the intonation of your voice, because that conveys the meaning of the exchange. Latency, meaning wait a while before so the child can take you in and only then engage the child. So this is an agile framework, and one of my team, Dr. Eileen McKeating, so kindly developed this little card that's laminated, actually. So the bumper sticker and the card we'll put on sale pretty soon. I'm just kidding. I don't think we will. But it's really to remind you of paying attention to agile, affect, gesture, intonation, latency, and engagement. So where does this lead me and to end with? It's one of the things that our center has tried to make our mantra, that whenever we think about professional development, helping the caregivers in early care and education settings and infant toddler space and early intervention and home visitation, but this is also, of course, our wish to support parents, is to think about how do we best grow our workforce, right? And so the term we're using instead of training is formation. So for those who know about our project called SEFI, that stands for the Socio-Emotional Formation Initiative, right? That means formation is that we believe that we have to cultivate not only knowledge, ways of knowing, we have to educate people about the science of brain systems, the science of infant and early childhood mental health, what we've learned about partnering with families, how we co-regulate children, and all of that. We have to certainly help you know strategies and tactics and methods, so the ways of doing. But the ways of knowing and the ways of doing are insufficient. That's classroom space. We need to help you think about ways of being with families, your own relationships that are formed, your affect, your gesture, your pacing, your movement, the way in which your voice and your demeanor and your posture and your pacing are helping families, conveying a sense of safety and security and interest, and co-regulating. And of course, that needs then to require that you take care of yourself. So we talk about the idea that personal development must be attended to as we attend to professional development. So that means that, for example, we must attend, or you must engage, we must engage your public self, the self that everybody sees when they meet you, your private self, that maybe even only those closest to you get to know. But then you have a secret self, and your secret self affects the things you do, the beliefs you have about families, the beliefs you have about yourself and the work. And so the heavy lift for formation is that it's not as easy to do, because it's not about going a course and getting a certificate. It's about subjecting yourself and us subjecting you to this rigorous way of paying attention to what's going on inside of you. So the implication for me is formation. So that's who we are. I think you know about our center, and I think Caitlin has probably been the most wonderful representation, Dr. Caitlin Mulcahy, of our center. We have a bunch of different programs, and we have a brand new one that's promoting full inclusion of schools, headed really by our Assistant Director for Consultation, Dr. Corinne Catalano. And so remember, at the end of this, all kids are always watching us. They're always imagining what are we meaning, what are we saying, what are we doing in order to help them. So we have about 10 minutes for some open discussion. I think we planned until 2:30. And so I'd like to stop there with gratitude again to ACNJ, to Seal Zalkin, to Hannah and Catherine for your help.
Great. Thank you so much, Jerry. That was Such an incredible presentation. And I'm sure you couldn't see the chat box while this was happening, but just a great response from all the participants who loved this information, just really learned a lot. So truly thank you. We do have a couple questions.
Great. Thanks so much.
So the first question is, when we were watching that Jack in the Box video,
Yes.
Mom took away the child's oral object that he was using to regulate. Did it change his response to the pop-up when he saw it?
Yep. Oh, and so the comment, I guess, was that kind of a helpful thing to do, or would that have been preferred? I wouldn't be surprised, of course, that wasn't staged. That was actually something that happened. I suspect that the parent did not think about the meaning that was having in the moment for the child. And I suspect even some of it was the mother believing that, and they're not competing approaches, the mother believing that her loving maternal comfort was by far the more important thing. But I think it would have been great to have the child keep it on. And I love in the second scene when Dane picks it up just as a way of saying, I'm looking right at you, but I need a little comfort to help myself, to keep myself together for it to go. So I think that's great. I think it's a great question.
Great. Thanks, Jerry. The next question I got was, do you see a way to unflip the lid when a child constantly cries out of fear of new things? And this is a question from, it sounds like a child care provider.
Yes.
Trying to use soothing and gentle talking, but it hasn't been working.
Oh, I believe there is, and I think at least the approach to it, one of the things that I've always wanted to be sure that I say when I think about certain children really having some struggles is never to believe that there is a one-size-fits-all approach that will work, because each child's story is going to be different, right? But I think one of the things one of the approaches may be helped by the notion that Dan Siegel shared of connect to the right, move to the left. So I have a little mnemonic device, a kind of memory thing that I call the 4 L's, and I'll just type in 4 L's. All right, and it stands for less language, longer latency. I think that many times when children are upset, we often tend to try to talk more to a child because we're hoping they will engage it. And even if our voice is soft and caring, we may really believe that the child can somehow be cajoled and convinced that we're okay, right? So I think we have to always follow the child's lead, and that may not necessarily be on the same timeline as an adult. So I think a child who is frightened, and by the way, in the new DC 0 to 5, classification system, for the first time ever, there is a brand new diagnosis that's called inhibition to novelty disorder. It's the first time that the crafters said maybe there are some children, for reasons that are not clear, may have an unusual response to novelty, to new situations, new people. And by the way, in the DC 0 to 5 framework, you look at a whole host of variables, including a child's developmental or medical circumstances, the psychosocial stressors, has there been trauma, and so on. So I would always want to be sure we think about that. But all things being equal, how we approach a child should be on their terms. So little language, don't make direct eye contact, be conscious of using fewer words, and if you use words, a lower tone of voice, of keeping your distance, not approaching the child too quickly, looking for nonverbal cues that the child may be able to take you in by looking up at you and then maybe giving a little kind of wave or a little engagement, going entirely on their terms. If you make the wave and the child starts crying, back up again, modulate yourself. It's a mutual regulation system. I mean, I think it really is about honoring the child's space, and there is no other way until the child is ready to feel like they're okay to approach you. What's so important, I'll share a secret, I'll never do it again though. For about 3 years, I was Santa Claus at my church for breakfast with Santa. And I prided myself on the fact that not one child ever cried on my lap because I would tell the parents, don't have him sit on my lap. He looks frightened. Sit next to me and have him sit on your lap, right? So if we're going to engage a child who's unfamiliar, they have to be close to the caregiver they know best, you know. But look, I know this is stuff I think you all know and you all have a sense of, but sometimes we feel such pressure to try to figure this out. So less language, lower affect, eye level, keep your distance, wait for the child to take you in. Those are some ways I would, and by the way, in cases where that's really not helpful and you try, you may want to sort of wonder if something else is happening. But for the most part, I think those rules will help with, I think, 90% of the time.
Great. Thanks, Jerry. And I'll also say that you and your team at the Montclair State University Center for Autism and Early Childhood Mental Health have created a great tool, your tools for transition, that I think childcare providers and parents and any other caregivers can really use during this time. You know, especially I think for childcare providers, you know, for our kids who maybe have been out for a while and are now coming back to our programs. And
well, that's great to hear. I mean, I honor the leadership of Dr. Caitlin Mulcahy and our team. A lot of people contributed to that. So thank you for saying that. We're thrilled to hear that. Yeah.
Great. I think we have time maybe for one more question, but let me see. I have a question. How do you think the brain is affected prenatal when a mom is depressed, very sick, or stressed?
Oh, that's so funny. I just yesterday tried to attend a webinar. One of my colleagues is a NICU nurse, and she was doing a presentation at a conference on the neonatal brain. And the question I asked is, what happens? I was curious about the transmission of the neurochemical changes that occur in a person under depression and how it affects the fetal brain. I can only speculate, right? I think, by the way, thinking about that for a parent is quite burdensome. For a parent who's struggling with depression, for them to believe that somehow they're damaging their fetus, right, is burdensome, right? And so I would never want to speculate that really there's a connection when in fact we don't know enough about the science. I think there is a growing amount of information. I don't know if Jill Wadnick's on, because I would always welcome Jill to sort of answer this. Jill's my guru when it comes to this stuff. I don't see her name. But here's what I would say. By far, the greatest effect will be postpartum. By far, even if a mother is suffering with perinatal depression or depression during pregnancy, and that may carry over to a postpartum depression. It is so critical for us to provide support for that parent and provide other caregivers who can really help support the baby and the mother as that's happening. So I would say I suspect, just as nutrition and drug abuse are toxins, poor nutrition and drug abuse are toxins during pregnancy and utero exposure, I suspect that there are some consequences of mood disorders when a parent is depressed, but I would suspect, without knowing the area enough, that whatever the effect is, I think it really is more important to think about postpartum life. By the way, there's an entire branch called prenatal psychology. There's an association for prenatal psychology. And there are lots of people who really write about this stuff. And I'm not particularly well trained in that, but I believe it's a field worthy of studies. So.
Great. Thanks, Jerry. We're just about out of time, but I just wanted to ask you, because we know that during this time, caregivers have been stressed, right? Between our pandemic, social unrest, everything that's happening, our caregivers have been stressed. And it's so important that we as caregivers take care of ourselves to be able to take care of our young children, right? So what could caregivers be doing during this time to make sure that they're being taken care of as well?
Oh, well, that's a terrific question. It's funny. One of the things that I think we're learning so much in our space at our center is to really learn how to breathe. It's so funny. I mean, it's become, I think, Hannah may be familiar, you're familiar with this, and certainly others, that oftentimes even for our own meetings of the Think Babies Coalition and the Celebrate Babies initiative, we have really begun our meetings with a chance to just center ourselves and breathe. And so, the self-care part is so critical. And I do think it's so hard for families to even allow themselves that commitment to take care of themselves. So, I certainly think that's one of them. I also think what I have found, and I think it's an outgrowth of our discussion today, I think parents should never, and I mean, not only within the family do they need connections, but among families. I think parents really need to know and communicate with other families. I think parents need to really speak to other mothers, need to speak to other mothers, fathers to other fathers, couples with other couples. I think it's easy to feel very alone in a COVID world, and certainly the social distancing has intensified that, because being together in person activates so much worry and stress about illness and death. So I think we need to find ways to have connections being made, with other families. So I would love every time, and we think about this, and I know we want to do more of this, but is there a way for us to really create forums where parents can really kind of drop in and sort of ask some questions and share their worries and concerns? But I believe that, so encouraging parent-to-parent contact is important. I think helping parents really think about self-care, and that's a whole host of ways, but it seems like one of the best ways, but I know it takes a commitment, is breathing. I think, Hannah, you've heard us talk about the 4-7-8 technique. I think that you breathe in for 4 seconds, hold it for 7 seconds, and breathe out for 8 seconds from your mouth. Breathe out, exhale as much as you can, because that activates the more calming parasympathetic nervous system. So, but I just wish we could find ways for parents to really feel like it's okay to talk to people about this stuff, because it's easy to feel alone with this. So
you're so right. And I'll just give one last plug for the great work that you guys are doing at the Montclair State Center, is that there is a 3 C's that you're opening, a 3 C's conversations for calm and connection. And it's an opportunity for our caregivers in childcare providers or our other professional fields caring for young children, that chance to come together and connect with each other. So I think that's a great opportunity, and we're happy to share that with everyone as well.
Yeah, thanks so much. And again, I really want to honor our team and Caitlin Mulcahy. Those 3 C's have really become so popular and desired. Jennifer, my good buddy Jennifer McConnelly asked a question that if I can mention, I know we have to hurry up, but how do you help caregivers shift their focus from working with children to seeing the importance of how they are, or ways of being with, as a focus of their relationship? And I think, Jennifer, I know you probably could answer this in a way as well as I could. And Jennifer's a talented psychologist, so she, I'm sure, thinks about this all the time and works with families. But what I really have found, and what I've done a lot, is to really pick experiences that staff members have, and build on that. So I'm really talking to them, and if they let you in on, so have you ever had a time where somebody made a crummy face at you and it just changed the way you felt about what was going on? And so we unpack that a bit, right? And sometimes even, I have this Dr. Lori Sullivan. I don't know if Lori's on. I'll talk about Lori a lot. Lori is my colleague, and she and I wrote a chapter for a book on reflective practices in 2009 for 0 to 3. And we had a chapter that had 8 activities to promote reflectivity. And Jennifer, it's kind of cool. One of them is movies without sounds. So I will meet with the staff, look at a movie, and without sound, and tell people, and hopefully a movie they didn't see, so some obscure movie, and tell people, okay, who do you think the good guys are? Who are the bad guys? What are they feeling? What are they conveying? To just talk about how critical facial expressions are. Real good actors know that, right? So sometimes even, Jennifer, using a benign activity like that, I begin to encourage them to think about their own face, and even joking. I mean, I can't remember how many times I said to myself that I would make a face and I would realize it was my mother's face, and I don't want to blame mothers, or it could have been my father, but my father died younger in my life. So I didn't have as much of his scary faces as my mother's did. I know scary is not the right word. You know where I'm saying, right? So, you catch yourself, you introject others. So, I mean, I think, Jennifer, this whole idea of being reflective is so critical. And I also think it is so incredible to just do baby watchings. We do baby watchings at our professional development programs where students have to go to a public setting. It's really hard in COVID. And find as young of a baby as possible and an adult with them, we don't know who they are, and actually record the transactions that occur between the adult and the child. And our wondering, because we talk about the importance of wondering, our wondering is to wonder what the baby's inner experience is like and how do you convey that. It's really a nice way to tune people into affect and gestures. And we give them our, Jennifer, I got to give you one of my Agile cards. So I got to get that to you. But listen, folks, I appreciate the chance to do this. And I thank Seal and Hannah and the gang. Thank you so much for asking me to do this. I know our time is up, but so important that we spend time like this. So thanks.
Yes, thank you again, Jerry. I'm not sure if you see everything in the chat, but everyone is just so thankful. Found this super helpful. So we can't thank you enough for your time in presenting this.
I really appreciate that, Hannah. Thanks a lot, and thank you.
Great.
Thanks,
Everyone.